here on the show, I want to talk a little bit about Gretchen Whitmer and what's happening in the state of Michigan. Yesterday, Governor Whitmer had a press conference, and I believe this is cut 8. And here's just a little taste of what she had to say about the progression of things.
We are flattening the curve. We do have reasons to feel like the work that we've done is paying off. As we re-engage, we have to do so slowly. This is not a political conversation. This is not a political negotiation. This is about the public health. That's precisely what these emergency powers are all about. And so as I use them, we cite all the sources of that power so that people understand this is the very kind of crisis that they are used in. I don't enjoy using all of these levers of this office, but I have to do this to save lives. And that is what centers every decision we've made. I know that it's hard. I know that people are stressed out, that people are feeling squirrely from being at home so much with their family. I know that people are worried about getting a job so that they can pay their bills, or whether or not their small business is going to make it. I have those same fears. And yet, I know we can't make decisions based on feeling and fear. We have to go with the facts and the science. Lives are depending on this. And ultimately, our economic health is depending on us getting this right.
So that's Governor Whitmer of Michigan, who has had some of the most draconian policies. I guess she's slowly opening up, very slowly, some elements of their economy. But her order was understandably challenged in court. And originally, a judge ruled against Whitmer's order, saying that it was unconstitutional, an unconstitutional infringement on the rights of the citizens, the residents of Michigan, their constitutionally protected rights. Well, there's something called the Michigan Court of Claims, and they ruled yesterday that the stay-at-home order does not infringe on constitutional rights. According to one news report, the court denied a motion for a preliminary injunction, ruling that the current version of Governor Gretchen Whitmer's executive order and previous versions don't violate rights. According to Attorney General Dana Nessel, this case, which is Martinko et al. V. Whitmer et al., alleged that the mandatory quarantine and interstate travel restrictions in an earlier version violated rights to both procedural due process and substantive due process. Well, Judge Christopher Murray said that the rights are fundamental, but also that the public's interests are important. Let's put up a portion. This is a stunning portion of Judge Murray's decision. The paragraph that I wanted to cite here is striking to me, and we're going to keep it on the screen for a moment. Those liberty interests are, and always have been, subject to society's interests, society being our fellow residents. And the paragraph goes on saying they, our fellow residents, have an interest to remain unharmed by a highly communicable and deadly virus. And since the state entered the Union in 1837, it has had the broad power to act for the public health of the entire state when faced with a public crisis. But look at those words we have on the screen. Those liberty interests are and have always been subject to society's interests. Now, that's not the case. He's got it backwards. Even though there can be a strong case made for many of the measures that have been taken by states across the country to stop the spread of this virus, the idea that liberty interests, which are fundamental to human beings, we've talked before on this show about natural rights, the idea that they are subject to society's interests is backwards. In fact, society's interests are subject to liberty interests. Don't believe me? Let's look at some of the founders of the country. Thomas Jefferson, in the first quote we've got here of course, the lead author of the Declaration of Independence, made this note, quote, "Rightful liberty is unobstructed action according to our will within limits drawn around us by the equal rights of others. I do not add within the limits of the law, because the law is often but the tyrant's will, and always so when it violates the rights of the individual." Notice that phrase there on the screen. He says, I do not add within the limits of the law, because law is often but the tyrant's will, and always so when it violates the rights of the people. In other words, the rights of the people come first, then the law comes second, which this is, in a sense, I suppose, the idea of law from what Whitmer has said. However, if we look at James Madison, we'll put up James Madison in a second, but James Madison, of course, is the architect of the Constitution. He's known as the father of the Constitution, the father of the Bill of Rights. And he was the one who put forward the idea of the Great Compromise at the Constitutional Convention that brought together the House and the Senate and set up the structure of our legislative branch. But he was also a fervent advocate for three separate branches of government that are co-equal. One of the things that Governor Whitmer is doing, and governors across the country, well, understandably so, I will say, in certain circumstances here, nevertheless, they are amassing their own power and making these decisions unilaterally, and oftentimes with very dubious authority for decisions that they make. But unilateral authority. So we have Thomas Jefferson pointing out that the rights of the people, in other words, the liberty interests, are first, and government is created, by the way, to protect individual rights, to protect individual liberty. Therefore, society, which is the next logical step, because that is an aggregation of individuals, society's interests stem from individuals' interests. But society's interests, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go to James Madison on the idea basically of concentrated power. He said, the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. That is James Madison in Federalist number 47. Remember, the Federalist Papers were the series of essays published in a handful of states making the case for passage of the United States Constitution by the individual states. The accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, whether of one, a few, or many, whether elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. So there you go. James Madison saying having one person with all sorts of power fits in with tyranny. Both Jefferson and Madison talking here about tyranny and concerns of government authority becoming tyrannical and trampling upon individual liberty, individual rights. In other words, liberty's interests, the liberty interests. Now let's go to one other quote from Thomas Jefferson about what history has shown us. He said, experience hath shown that even under the best forms of government, those entrusted with power have, in time, and by slow operations, perverted it into tyranny. Even under the best forms of government, those entrusted with power have, in time, and by slow operations, perverted it into tyranny. Now, Jefferson was not an author of the Constitution. He was the author of the Declaration of Independence. He was not at the Constitutional Convention. But he laid forward in the Declaration the fundamental ideals of this country, which were then built into the U.S. Constitution under Madison's guidance, and a whole slew of other folks. But Madison is known as the father of the Constitution for a reason. In other words, let's put up Judge Murray's quote again. Judge Christopher Murray of the Michigan Court of Claims ruling yesterday that the stay-at-home order does not infringe on constitutional rights because those liberty interests are and always have been subject to society's interests, society being our fellow residents. Let me ask a question. Who determines what is in society's interests, and who is supposed to be able to determine the extent to which society's interests, however that has been determined, trump, are more important than liberty interests, are more important than fundamental rights? I'm not saying there aren't reasonable things that the government could be doing as far as some restrictions. And I'm someone who said here in Colorado, hey, I'm good with through April. After April, you need to get things opening up. And you need to do it very strongly. And not a lackluster effort that takes months and months and months. And I think that needs to be the case for most of the country too, if not all of the country at this point. But the reality is that here we have a judge upholding unilateral actions, grandiose powers by an overzealous governor, in my view, who has done some strongly draconian things in the state of Michigan, and focusing on this idea of society's interests trumping liberty interests, again, as determined somehow by the government. That does not jive with the quotes we put up of the founding fathers, such as James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. Again, I believe that we need to take this virus seriously. I said that from the beginning. We need to take appropriate measures, especially personal responsibility. We need to make sure, for example, these rallies and protests that are happening, make sure that you are following through with the social distancing guidelines. Just as a basic, if you're going to gather together, at a minimum, go ahead and make sure that you are following through with the social distancing guidelines. Because we need to do our part. But the way in which this is unfolding, particularly this judge's broad order and the judge's broad statement about liberty interests being always being subject to society's interests, that's a different story. Thanks for watching this clip from Jimmy at the Crossroads. You do not want to miss a minute of engaging, intelligent talk. Subscribe today to the Jimmy at the Crossroads YouTube channel, and you'll be sure to catch our live broadcast. I appreciate your support.
I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah.